I hope everyone is doing well on this Friday Eve. My name is Brianna Jones, and I am the Assistant Director here at the Leadership Institute at Columbus State University. And we want to welcome you to our first Disruptive Leadership webinar for the year. We are kicking this series off with cultural competency. And again, thank you for spending some time with us today. We hope to make this webinar very interactive and engaging. So we will be using the Q&A feature to take questions throughout. I'll pause the speaker throughout the presentation, just to, monitor the chat and making sure that I'm getting all of your questions in. So feel free to just drop your questions throughout the presentation. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Janae Roberts. Janae serves as the Diversity Programs and Service Coordinator within Student Life and Development here at CSU. In this role, she serves on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which brings a number of great programmings to the CSU campus, as well as ensuring that our students have programs created to promote inclusiveness. In addition to her work for diversity, she is constantly active on campus. You will probably see her moving around, assisting with the Cougar Kickoff, Homecoming, or working with the Men About Change program, which is a program through the University System of Georgia designed to support our undergraduate African American male students for success. So please welcome in the chat, Janae, send some warm welcomes. As I said, I will jump in to take questions from the audience, but for now, I'll turn it over to you, Janae.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Janae Roberts, and I'm super excited to be the first to present for the Disruptive Leadership Series this semester. So I do want to, give you a little more background of my experience in diversity and inclusion work. So currently in this role going into 3 years. Prior to that, I served as the graduate assistant at the University of West Georgia in their Center for Diversity and Inclusion. And even prior to that, I did some work with College Access, which is where, we talk about the value of our students and how can we best support them through their journey to graduate and reach college. So that post-secondary level. So I'm super excited, like I said, to talk about this. And our topic today is understanding the value of everyone, and with that, cultural competence. All right, so with this slide here, I want you to, if you're sitting at your office desk, maybe close your eyes for a moment and I want to set the scene. So imagine you are given a team project with your colleagues. During this assignment, each person is bringing a new perspective to the project. So imagine you are a part of this group and you feel like every single statement you're providing is being ignored. So with all of that, how would you feel? Would you want to continue to speak up? How would you act in a group setting after this encounter? And then you can feel free to drop that in the chat, some of those thoughts. But Rihanna, I'm going to pose it to you. Like, how would you feel if you're in a moment where you don't feel like anything you're saying is being taken into account?
Yes, I have been in situations before where, I've experienced being the one who was kind of, outside or felt like an outcaster. And it made me feel, I would say, somewhat of an imposter because, I probably felt like I wasn't contributing to the group or, why is it that I'm here? I was brought into this meeting to offer up my ideas and my opinions. But sometimes in that moment, you can, when your thoughts aren't being heard, you can kind of feel insecure and kind of, feel like, well, why am I in the room, and feeling a bit of that imposter syndrome.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've definitely also been in scenarios where I'm trying to give my opinion. I think like, oh, I have this valuable component to present to my group and I felt ignored. And for me, I didn't want to bring any other ideas to the table. So on the flip side of that, imagine if everyone you're giving these ideas and everyone just takes everything you're saying into consideration. They love the ideas and they want to implement them. How would you feel? Would you continue to speak up? And how would you feel with this group encounter?
And while we're waiting for some people to drop some comments in the chat, Johnny, I will definitely share my personal experience. On the flip side of that, when you are in the room and your ideas are welcomed, and people are actually acknowledging some of the thoughts and opinions that you're throwing out during the brainstorming or collaboration period, it's validating. For me, I know that it makes me feel a sense of importance, and that builds up the confidence, and you're able to brainstorm even more, and it starts coming out somewhat of word vomit because you're so excited and you've kind of gotten that boost that you needed. So that's what I've experienced, based on my personal experience when I am welcomed into the conversation.
And I love that all that you said, because you really, like, for both scenarios, if you're feeling ignored, you don't want to bring other ideas to the table. And on the flip side of that, you feel validated. You're just like, well, let me continue to provide these ideas and provide my new perspective so we can move forward as a group. And when we think about what that looks like, leadership and cultural competency, they very much go hand in hand, because when, let's say, to make it cultural related, right? If someone of a different background is bringing a new perspective and they feel that you're shutting their idea down just because of their cultural background, they won't want to say anything else to you. They won't do anything, and they might just do what they're told, but you're missing such a valuable component. So we want to think about those, and that will get us right into our topic. So the purpose of today's discussion, of course, is to be able to identify your own culture and the culture of others. And I really love that point, because the goal is to not erase your culture, but it's to know your culture and be able to identify it, but also be able to have conversations with other folks and to appreciate the cultures that they come from, because we all come from different walks of life. The next is be more self-aware in everyday encounters. In the past, and you may have gone through every day just thinking about yourself and people who identify the same culture as you, but there are so many other folks in this world, and we want to make sure that we're being self-aware and conscious of those folks. The next is learn the differences and similarities within other cultures. And I really, really enjoy this one here, because, of course, different cultures have differences, right? But there are also many similarities, and what it really takes is having that conversation to push and see what they are. All right, so how do we tie value into that? So break it down.
Before you move on, I do want to acknowledge a comment that came in. Someone said that as a leader, sometimes I speak too soon and unintentionally silence those around me who are speaking first. And I think that really goes to talk about what you said in your last statement. It's about learning differences and learning similarities. And I think that sometimes as a leader, we're so quick, to kind of speak up and be the first person in the room to break the silence. And sometimes that will, close the opportunity to learn, and to hear from other people.
I really love that. And as a leader, sometimes we always might think we're right. And the fact of the matter is, we might be right, but that doesn't mean that somebody else's way is wrong. So if we open the platform to give other people in that space time to present their ideas, they could have, like I said, the right way, but they could go about it in a different way. But it doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it different. And you might want to adopt that idea even after hearing it. So thank you so much for that comment. I love it. All right. So when we talk about cultural competence, and I want to take it a step further and first break down value. And I found these via, I believe, Webster, but value is defined as the regard that something is held to a high regard, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. A person's principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. And when we think about our values, and the next slide will go further into that. But when we think about what we hold in high regard, we probably have a number of things. Like, for instance, what is something I hold in high regard? I hold education. And for me, I hold that in high regard based on my family and the values that they instilled in me. They always told me to push and persevere and go for what I want. So with that in mind, I'm always thinking about my education being super important. And there are so many other things I could jump in and talk about. So for this slide, I also incorporated the diversity wheel. And if you ever Google diversity wheel, you will see so many different examples of it. But I put that there because based on the different values you hold, different points of this diversity wheel could be held in high regard. So we see like race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, so many different layers can be held in high regard, or if you were to prioritize, we will all have different lists. So this is like one of my favorite slides, and I love to talk about it, and I love to give examples. So throughout the presentation, I will be providing like different real life examples and scenarios, and also feel free to drop something in the chat to give some examples from your own life. But for me, when I pose this question, like what is culture? It's the way of life or the way that groups of people do things. You also see here it says it encompasses religion, food, what we wear, how we wear it, like literally all different things. In this last point, it says set of rules and norms that promote stability and harmony within society. So, excuse me, for some examples I put here, and I'll explain because you're probably like, what do you mean? But for me, entering a room, and I know you're like, okay, but when I was considered myself very family oriented. And when I go to my grandparents' house, I walk in that space and I make sure, prior to the pandemic, I walk in, I hug every single person in the room. Because that is how like my mom taught me, that's how my dad, like everyone, they came in the room, and of course I'm following what I see. So if they come in and speak to every single person in the room, that is now a part of my culture. And that's a part of the rules and norms that I set for myself. And it keeps harmony. If I ever came in the room and didn't speak to everyone and left, there would definitely be a conversation. And I'm aware of it. So I make sure to keep the harmony, but also because it's something, if I don't do it, I feel awkward and I feel like, it doesn't feel right for me.
And that's exactly how I feel sometimes, entering into a room, it means, something different for me as far as what I value. When I enter a room, I make it a point to greet everyone in the room or acknowledge and say hello. So, just the simple example of entering a room, I think it means something different, for me and you as far as, the purpose of it. But for me, I just think it's mannerism, acknowledging people when you come into the room and just greeting people and saying hello. I think that I grew up in Florida, so it's not really considered necessarily a southern state. But being that I went to undergrad in Tallahassee, which is closer, which is North Florida, I kind of picked up on some of those, traditional southern ways of living. And definitely, kind of when you enter into the room, just making sure that you greet and acknowledge people. That's something that I hold valuable to me, and that I kind of embraced as that southern culture.
Very, very good point. And you also mentioned like mannerisms and different things like that. So I take me into a professional setting. Anytime I enter a space, I might not know everyone in the room, but I might just send that general, and I'm also Southern, so I'm going to just send that general, hey y'all, greeting, just so everyone knows I have acknowledged them. And that really carries some weight. People, they like to see that. And they would know what your values are, and maybe that's not something they have done, but they might adopt it because they liked it so much. The next one I put on here is Sunday dinner, and that is just based on when we're younger, we will go to like church service, and after we came back, we knew that at my grandparents' house, there was going to be a Sunday dinner. And whatever it was, we were all going to sit together as a family and enjoy, talk about church service, the greetings after church. And we were just going to connect before we all like dispersed and went to our respective homes for, go back to school on Monday. So that for me, that was something that we did that was a part of our culture. Super, super things. And I'm sure y'all can probably think of so many other examples of parts of your culture that are like sets of rules or norms.
And Janae, could you tell us a little bit more about some of your non-traditional cultural norms? I don't want to speak for you, but if those were more of your formal, kind of cultural values, what did you, learn to value just by, being an adult and growing into your own, if you don't mind answering?
That. Something that I've grown to appreciate as an adult, I would say, and it kind of goes back to me speaking when I come in the space or whatever. But in the mornings, I give greetings, and then I give folks, like I come to my office, I have my time to myself to really get ready for the day. And I think that's something that my other office members have done as well. So we all give ourselves that time to really take it all in, write down our to-do list, and knock out whatever we need to before we go and kind of jump into different office spaces. For me, I think that's something through graduate school and through just being in the workplace setting, that's something that I've adopted, realizing that folks need their time to just be to themselves.
And I think that's important. I think we often overlook some of those non-traditional, values that add to who we are as a person or who we identify. So I'm glad you shared that. And please continue.
So when we talk about culture and continuing through that conversation, and I gave some examples of it prior, but it's that filter through which people process their experiences and events of their lives. So again, I mentioned being family oriented and some of the things that I learned from my family. So it's that filter. The next thing is it influences people's values, actions, and expectations of themselves. So moving forward in life, I know that when I walk into a space, I want to speak to folks because it makes me kind of feel at home and it makes me feel comfortable. And the last point here is it impacts people's perception and expectations of others. Now, this one is really important because I think sometimes what we hold as our number one value or a part of our culture, we expect others to have those same expectations. And the biggest thing is that as we move forward through life, we might hold something in high regard, but we also have to acknowledge that people aren't having that same type of, that's not a part of their identity. So for instance, when I was in graduate school, like I said, I come into the room and speak to individuals, but people didn't necessarily speak back to me. And at first I could have taken that and, held a grudge or been offended by this, but realizing that everyone doesn't do the same thing. And for them, they might have just needed that time to themselves prior to class starting to jump in and really be a part of the lesson. So I had to make sure that based on what my culture was, it wasn't impacted based on that. All right, so now we're into the good stuff. So cultural competency, what is it? So it is that the will and actions to build understanding between people. So it's really understanding groups of people that are unlike yourself. When we talk about what makes individuals diverse, what makes our campus diverse, and what makes the world diverse, it's knowing that there are so many different people in this world that are unlike you. If you were to go into a room or a space and you let me find someone who does everything like me, you're not really growing as a person, you're not learning, and you're really halting your growth efforts. And you're really not achieving that cultural competency, right? So the next point here is to be respectful and open to different cultures and cultural perspectives. Strengthen cultural security, and work toward equality and opportunity. So that is essentially respecting others, even if you don't know their cultural processes or the processes. Knowing that you have different identities and knowing it's okay. Where I always use the example as identifying as a Black woman. And just because I identify as a Black woman and someone else identifies as a Black woman, we do not have the same background at all. Or we can, but there could be this high percentage that we don't. We could have different socioeconomic status. We could have grown up in different religious sectors. We may not be religious at all. We could have someone could be from a military family versus like not being military related. So many things of that nature. So you just have to remember that you respect folks, although you may not identify with those folks. And another example of that is just saying something that was off the top of your head, and when corrected, you immediately take what it said into consideration. So you could say something that, again, it says, you say something that someone disagrees with and say, actually, this is something of my culture, and you hear it, you learn from it, and you take it into consideration, and moving forward, you don't make the same mistake again. That is gaining that cultural competency. And we have understanding each other's expectations and attitudes. And again, it goes back to that walking in the room. When I walk into a space, now that I'm understanding each other's expectations and their attitudes, I know that just because I do that doesn't mean another person will. And here we have building on the strengths of others' knowledge and using a wide range of community members and resources to build on their understandings. And I really love that because you learn so much more when you become a part of a group and you're hearing different sides. So that icebreaker we did before, when you take into account everyone's thoughts, even though you don't understand their cultural background, you are building on those strengths. They feel validated, you feel validated, you are able to provide so many more additional resources to the community.
And Janae, I think that it's important for us to talk about others' willingness to kind of offer up, some of those cultural values. I think that we are, in a time where some people, in marginalized groups or people of color or the minority in whatever population, I think that, we tend to forget that there are differences, and that, some people just don't know. So how do you approach someone to ask them about their cultural preferences, their rules and their norms without being offensive?
And I think that's a really good question because a lot of people are still very much trying to tackle that question. But I think about when I was in undergrad, and I was sitting beside one of my peers in the classroom, and she identified as Muslim. And just having, we're just talking, and we found similarities. And when we found those similarities, we were able to talk about those. And then we also branched out and talk about the differences between the religious differences that are there. And that is an opening. I never advise folks to just come up and say, hey, so you're different. Tell me about yourself. Because that's not necessarily the right direction to go, but I think you can have a respectful conversation and say, like, hey, so I've done some research on this topic, and, I recognize that you may not know everything about it, and I don't want you to feel like you have to, this is your space to tell me everything. But this is a question that I had that I couldn't necessarily find in my research. If you show that you've done a little work prior to coming to someone for questions, people are more receptive. And also the tone in which you ask a question. It's all about the phrasing. If you come and just say, so this is different from what I do, they may not be receptive. But if you come and say, hey, so this is what I have seen done many times, and I just want to understand like why this happens. And that also made me think about another experience in undergrad. Just talking to some girls who were had different culture than myself, just having the open communication, like, hey, so why do you do this during this time of day? And they were open to sharing because they knew I was genuinely curious, and I wasn't saying to be like antagonistic or anything, but a general curiosity.
Thank you for that, Janae. I think that was spot on ways and strategies on how we can approach others that are different from us. The most important thing you said, for me, that stuck out was just opening up with those similarities first. Before we get into the differences, let's talk about how we are alike. So I do thank you for that. That was great advice.
And I feel like it's so much easier when we talk about our similarities versus when we talk about those differences. Again, we have to talk about tone. We talk about how we break up something. If you break up those differences first, you might get a negative reaction, not necessarily the reaction you wanted. But if you talk about similarities and that curious tone, but also understanding that there is work that you have to do on your end, you've opened the floor and you've given folks space and opportunity for that. All right, so we talked about cultural competency and what is it. So now I like to talk about the flip side and address some barriers to cultural competency and what those could be. And there are more than just these three, but I saw these three and I'm like, yes, I would love to talk about these today. So the first we have here is ethnocentric, which is a tendency to look at the world primarily from one perspective, from the perspective of one's own culture. And it's also the belief that one's own race, ethnic, or cultural group is the most important, or that some or all aspects of its culture are superior to those of other groups. And from the prior slides we just went over, we know that those are not true statements. We know that we have to take a second to understand and be aware of what our own cultures are, but also that other cultures bring so much important things and they bring value to our lives when we have open conversation. So an example of that, which I really found interesting, is when we talk about like Americans often talk about British drivers driving on the wrong side of the road. And when we say that, why are we not just saying they drive on the opposite side of the road or even the left-hand side? So again, it's that statement like, why is this the way it is? And not just acknowledging that it's a cultural difference. For them, the left side of the road works. For us, the right side of the road works. And we just, acknowledge it and move forward. And the next here we have is discrimination. And that is when a person is treated less favorably because of some aspects of their identity. When we think back to that first icebreaker, and let's say you were in this group project and you felt that people weren't holding your thoughts and opinions in high regard. And it could, let's say it was because of your cultural background. Let's say it was because you're unpopular or all these other things. We need to make sure we're not creating these barriers. So we have folks who want to give fresh ideas, who want to give their cultural experiences, who are open to sharing, and who don't feel like they can't do that. Because the worst thing we can do is not allow folks to be who they are, so that we can grow as people. We want to make sure everybody is growing and everybody is being leaders and growing as leaders. And the next thing we have here is like cultural pitfalls. And I thought this was really interesting. So a couple of those things is, of course, knowing that valuing culture is important, but failing to make it a top priority. And when we think about being a leader, let's say you work in this leadership role and you make a statement about how culture is so important, but you never talk about it again. You're showing the people who may serve as may serve underneath you or in other positions that you say value, like culture is important, but you're not showing that it is. So we have to talk about putting our words into action. The next is, of course, ignoring culture. So you made the statement, but you're not acknowledging culture. And you may think of it as like, well, I don't want to pick a side. But by ignoring different cultures, you are picking a side and setting up what is culture by default by not doing that. The next is, of course, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, is talking without action behind it. And being a leader, you must go first, and your organization will follow through by looking at your example. So making sure that if you say culture is important, how are your actions being into place? The next I put here is lack of practice. Is like you can't mention culture as an important component, then say nothing about it ever again. And cultural competency is a consistent practice. You have to make sure and constantly be self-aware that all of your actions and putting it into practice, people are noticing those things, and they're excited to see it when it's being put in practice.
And I think that's really important because, we often, or I would say in the past 2 years, we have experienced a lot of companies, releasing statements and kind of vowing to be inclusive, but then we don't see that embraced. And on the flip side of that, there are some bigger brands that have released some of these DEI statements, and we've seen a difference. Just watching TV and watching commercials, sports commercials from Nike or Gatorade, they are showing, Paralympics gold medalists. They are really kind of expanding, body representation and what it means to actually celebrate differences and people that are not like you.
I love that. You definitely hit on a lot of different things. And as you were talking, I thought about so many different things. So like brands, if a company says they promote for a certain like body shape and they do one commercial, but then when you go to find their materials, you can't find any in that size or that shape, that really is discouraging. And you're just like, well, maybe I won't shop at that company anymore. Or I always use the example of every June, which is Pride Month. So we recognize and celebrate different folks who are members of the LGBTQIA plus community. People utilize that month to do a lot of branding. After that month, sometimes you don't see anything else about it. So like, how are you supporting and how are you celebrating that community? So we talk about barriers, that lack of practice, and just falling into those cultural pitfalls. Super, super important that we are embracing and celebrating folks for who they are, learning about different cultures. And that is taking that next step to figure out, you can do research on your end, and you can also have all those open conversations. Oh, which leads into our next segment here, open conversations with diverse groups. We talked about making sure our tone and phrasing and all of those things are there and they're important. So making sure that we don't just stop with people who look like us and who are like us, but we are branching out to a number of different diverse groups. And last here, I put in attitudes must change and become less ethnocentric and biased, meaning that if you are having those thoughts that your ethnicity, your culture is more important than the next person, really, again, go back to self-reflection and self-assessment and see how we can bridge that gap so that it's not happening and you're not making people feel like their opinions aren't valid and that they don't matter. All right. So now we are at the cultural baggage and reflection activity. So with this, you see a little picture of a cultural baggage, and I really love it. So take a moment and jot down some things. You can also drop it in the chat box and think about what are some things that you would put in your cultural baggage activity. For instance, some things I mentioned prior is Sunday dinners. That's something I love to do with my family. Myself and my sisters also do sister trips. So for like birthdays or when we're home for holidays and whatever, we might say, oh, let's plan to go to like New Orleans. Let's do something fun together. So at this point, I will put that as a part of my culture, again, family oriented, but wanting to just spend time with the three of us. Also being from the South, I love my sweet tea. And for me, that's a part of my cultural baggage experience. I've gone to the North and I'm like, oh, can I get sweet tea? And if they're like, oh, we have hot tea, I'm like, no, just give me a Sprite. I've definitely had scenarios with that, and for me, I'm like, I need it. And then relating it back to our CSU community, the clock tower. We have so many events at the clock tower. When we talk about when you're directing a student or you're directing someone to different places on campus, you can say, okay, go to the clock tower first. Once you're there, if you see this building, go towards that direction. And we have a number of events on campus at the clock tower, like our career kickoff events, homecoming events, and so many more. But that is definitely a staple. And even on our logos. So we make sure it is seen everywhere. So maybe, like I said, jot down a couple of those things. And then I want to pose these reflection questions to you all. How truly open am I to those of a different cultural background? And I like to think about when I was younger, and me and my sister actually had this conversation. She was like, you know, Johnny, you've changed so much from when you first enrolled in undergrad. And she's correct. But you also, you know, like life experiences changes you as a person. But so who I came into school as an undergraduate student to where I am now has completely shifted. And I definitely know where the shift has occurred. We think about like, what are some of my core beliefs and how have they been culturally influenced? Throughout this presentation, I definitely told y'all so many stories about family. So y'all know, like, for me, my family and going to my grandparents' house and these different things shaped my core beliefs. And they were culturally influenced, as well as what their parents and family members did before them, and so forth. The next thing we have is, do I know how to evaluate interactions through an intercultural lens? So for that question, I like to go back to the self-reflection, self-awareness. Are we making sure that our statements are open? And are we making sure our statements are not offensive? And if we did make a statement that could be like, we might need to rethink that. How can we change the phrasing so that it's open to folks? So I was like, I know I said a lot, but.
Thank you, Janae, for those good reflection questions. I know for me, I can relate to having grown and having some of those core values to be influenced by where I am regionally or where I'm staying at in that time. Prior to living in Georgia, as I said, I'm from Florida. So, and prior to undergrad, I had a lot of experiences with Central Florida and with South Florida, but not so much North Florida. So going to undergrad in North Florida, it is completely, different. And a lot of that, being in that kind of, Tallahassee is a lot more southern than Orlando is. So being in that environment kind of shaped some of the yes ma'ams and no sir that I inherited during that undergrad experience, just based on where I was, geographically. So I think that that plays a lot into, kind of the values and core beliefs that influence us and that become a part of our culture. And then on the flip side of that, I value growing up in around South Florida and Central Florida. I have a high value of diversity and inclusion because, I went to school, with a lot of Caribbean kids. I went to school with a lot of Hispanic kids. So just that melting pot of cultures and food, I really think that kind of shaped me and who I am to the core of wanting to live somewhere that is culturally inclusive, because that's just how I grew up. And to not have that, in my everyday space, it kind of is, it does affect, who I am and how I show up to work. Some days, I try not to let it, but it does show up. I do have a question from the chat, Janae. Someone anonymously submitted and said, I feel discounted by others for my Southern accent sometimes. People not from the South assume I don't know what I am talking about. And that is funny because I can relate. So, Janae, do you have anything to say or any experiences to share, when that has probably happened to you?
I think that's a good question. And I'm sure, I don't know, like I'm in the South, so I don't necessarily mind saying y'all and all the different things that we get from these great Southern accents. But in that scenario, that's a very good question. But in that scenario, I'm just like, I might even acknowledge like, hey, like I know I have this accent and I know it's great, but there's still a lot of great things that I can bring to this conversation. So I'll, there could be something like I know I'm very Southern, but like feel free to let me know if I need to rephrase something or say it again to make sure that like your words aren't getting discounted. I do think that sometimes when we go to different places, they're like, oh my gosh, that accent is so great. But that doesn't mean that the words we're saying in the value of our knowledge should be discounted. So want to make sure that we, push through and just say, yeah, I know, but let's talk about this right here. Let's talk about the issues at hand, and let's talk about why we have this meeting today.
Thank you. I think it's as simple as clarifying, whether or not you can properly hear me, or if I need to rephrase, I should say. I think that's a great kind of action to flip that narrative of I don't know what I'm talking about. Do I need to rephrase it in a different way? So thank you for that. Janae, please unmute your mic. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, coming in clear.
Learning curves today. Okay. But yeah, thank y'all so much for being a part of this conversation with us. So attached is diversity programs and services, social media. I'm here if y'all have any questions. We do so many different things. We also, let's see other presentations we've done. Presentation on LGBTQIA+. We also have done implicit bias and race and ethnicity. We are super, super open. Just email us and let us know what you would like to see. And we're there for y'all.
Thank you so much, Janae. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you for taking the time to talk to us today about cultural and cultural competency. So again, thank you, Janae. If you want this information to be sent to you, this recording or the resources from today's presentation, if you will go ahead and drop your email address in the chat, and I'll make sure that I send that out to you within 48 hours. I do want you all to know that we have our next Disruptive Leadership Series webinar will be March 31st, and we're going to be talking about servant leadership during that time. So we look forward to seeing you at our next Disruptive Leadership webinar, and thank you for creating this safe space and being a part of this conversation today. Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.